Hey everyone, happy Monday. It's the 4th and I hope you're doing well and I hope you had a good weekend. And I hope you're ready to finish this book with me together. I'm going to read the whole chapter this morning. And then we'll have a little bit of a chat at the end. I'm sure the end of the book will give you lots to think about, and I don't know if it will be a surprise or not, depending on how you've read and what you're thinking about. We'll see. So anyway, I'm just going to backtrack a bit to the end of chapter 5. Curly's wife has been killed by Lenny by mistake. Curly's wife and Lenny were in the barn together talking. Curly's wife explained all of her life dreams that kind of were deferred or just, didn't turn out the way she wanted them to. And, Lenny isn't capable of understanding or following any of that. And he got close to her. He wanted to touch her hair. And then he grabbed on just like he did in Weed. And he was unable to let go. She screamed. He tried to cover her mouth. He shook her. And he broke her neck like in an instant. She wasn't able to withstand his strength, and he knew he did something bad. But he knows his plan, and he knows where to hide, and you all know where he can hide, where he's supposed to hide, in the brush, if something bad happened. So this is at the end. The men have, what sometimes it's called a lynch mob, but they're not looking to lynch or hang Lenny. They're looking to shoot him. In fact, he says, Curly, maybe you better stay here with your wife. And Curly says, I'm going to shoot the guts out of the big bastard myself, even if I got one hand. Going to get him. Okay, so that brings us to chapter 6. And here we are. And I don't know what this cat is doing. Is it a cat at all? I don't know what that is. Okay. The deep green pool of the Salinas River was still in the late afternoon. Already the sun had left the valley to go climbing up the slopes of the Gabilan Mountains, and the hilltops were rosy in the sun. But by the pool among the mottled sycamores, a pleasant shade had fallen. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisting its periscope head. Remember that image from the very first chapter? From side to side, and swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of the motionless heron that stood in the shadows. A silent head and beak lanced down and plucked it out by the head, and the beak swallowed the little snake while its tail waved frantically. Okay, so here's a contrast. Right, there's all this peace and stillness, and then the snake, here's that snake, and a heron, which is one of those stork-looking kind of birds. I don't know, that's supposed to be a stork. He reaches down and he pierces the snake and he eats it with the little tail waving as it's going down its gullet. So that contrast of this violence, breaking the peace of the moment, sets this chapter off. A far rush of wind sounded, and a gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave. The sycamore leaves turned up their silver sides. The brown, dry leaves on the ground scudded a few feet. And row on row of tiny wind waves flowed up the pool's green surface. As quickly as it had come, the wind died, and the clearing was quiet again. The heron stood in the shallows, motionless and waiting. Another little water snake swam up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. Suddenly, Lenny appeared out of the brush, and he came as silently as a creeping bear moves. The heron pounded the air with its wings, jacked itself clear of the water, and flew off downriver. The little snake slid in among the reeds at the pool's side. Lenny came quietly to the pool's edge. He knelt down and drank, barely touching his lips to the water. When a little bird skittered over the dry leaves behind him, his head jerked up, and he strained toward the sound with eyes and ears until he saw the bird, and then he dropped his head. and drank again. Okay, so Lenny here is like an animal himself, right? And it's reminiscent of when he first got down on all hands and knees and slurped that dirty water. So Steinbeck is bringing this image back again. When he was finished, he sat down on the bank with his side to the pool so that he could watch the trail's entrance. He embraced his knees and laid his chin down on his knees. The light climbed on out of the valley, and as it went, the tops of the mountains seemed to blaze with increasing brightness. Lenny said softly, "I didn't forget you bet, God damn. Hide in the brush and wait for George." He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "George gonna give me hell," he said. "George gonna wish he was alone and not have me bothering him." He turned his head and looked at the bright mountaintops. "I can go right off there and find a cave," he said, and continued sadly, "and never have no ketchup. But I wouldn't care. If George don't want me, I'll go away. I'll go away." And of course we've heard this before, right? This is Lenny's mantra. This is what he says. And then from out of Lenny's head there came a fat little old woman. Nope, a little fat old woman. She wore thick bull's eyeglasses, and she wore a huge gingham apron with pockets, and she was starched and clean. She stood in front of Lenny and put her hands on her hips, and she frowned disapprovingly at him. And when she spoke, it was in Lenny's voice. "I told you and I told you," she said. "I told you, mind George because he's such a nice fella and good to you, but you don't never take no care. You do bad things." And Lenny answered her, "I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am, I tried and tried. I couldn't help it." Okay, so here Lenny is hallucinating. Okay, and he's hallucinating that his Aunt Clara is back here, scolding him when he's all alone. It came out of Lenny's head. And I don't think Lenny hallucinates often. I think the stress of this moment has brought out, this person from his life visiting him in his head. And it's just sad. "You never give a thought to George," she went on in Lenny's voice. "He been doing nice things for you all the time. Why, he got a piece of pie. You always got half or more'n half. And if they was any ketchup, why, he'd give it all to you." "I know," said Lenny miserably. "I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried and tried." She interrupted him. "All the time he could have had such a good time if it wasn't for you. He would have took his pay and raised hell in a whorehouse. And he could have sat in a pool room and played snooker. But he got to take care of you." Lenny moaned with grief. "I know, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I'll go right off in the hills and I'll find a cave and I'll live there so it won't be no more trouble to George." "You just say that," she said sharply. "You always saying that. And you know son of a bitching well you ain't never gonna do it. You'll just stick around and stew the bejesus out of George all the time." Lenny said, "I might just as well go away. George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now." And Clara was gone. And from out of Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. It sat on his haunches in front of him, and it waggled its ears, and it crinkled its nose at him, and it spoke in Lenny's voice too. "10 rabbits," it said scornfully. "You crazy bastard, you ain't fit to lick the boots of no rabbit. You'd forget 'em and let 'em go hungry. That's what you'd do. And then what would George think?" "I would not forget," Lenny said loudly. "The hell you wouldn't," said the rabbit. "You ain't worth a greased jackpin to ram you into hell. Christ knows George done everything he could to jack you out of the sewer, but it don't do no good. If you think George gonna let you 10 rabbits, you're even crazier than usual. He ain't. He gonna beat the hell out of you with a stick. That's what he's gonna do." "Now," Lenny retorted belligerently, "he ain't neither. George won't do nothing like that. I've knew George since I forget one, and he ain't never raised his hand at me with a stick. He's nice to me. He ain't gonna be mean." "Well, he's sick of you," said the rabbit. "He's gonna beat hell out of you and then go away and leave you." "He won't," Lenny cried frantically. "He won't do nothing like that. I know it, George. Me and him travels together." But the rabbit repeated softly over and over, "He gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. He gonna leave you all alone. He gonna leave ya, crazy bastard." And this is reminiscent of Crooks's conversation, if you remember. Crooks said, "He's gonna leave you. What if he never comes back?" And you can just see, Lenny has no one, right? He's got just his own mind to talk to without George, which is, this is adding just some depth to the sadness of his condition here. Lenny put his hands over his ears. "He ain't, I tell you, he ain't," and he cried, "Oh, George, George, George." George came quietly out of the brush, and the rabbit scuttled back into Lenny's brain. George said quietly, "What the hell are you yelling about?" Lenny got up on his knees. "You ain't gonna leave me, are you, George? I know you ain't." George came stiffly near and sat down beside him. "No." "I knowed it," Lenny cried. "You ain't that kind." George was silent. Lenny said, "George?" "Yeah?" "I done another bad thing." "It don't make no difference," George said, and he fell silent again. Only the topmost ridges were in the sun now. The shadow in the valley was blue and soft. From the distance came the sound of men shouting to one another. George turned his head and listened to the shouts. Lenny said, "George?" "Yeah?" "Ain't you gonna give me hell?" "Give you hell?" "Sure, like you always done before. Like, if I didn't have you, I'd take my $50. Jesus Christ, Lenny. You can't remember nothing that happens, but you remember every word I say. "Well, ain't you gonna say it?" George shook himself. He said woodenly, "If I was alone, I could live so easy." His voice was monotonous. He had no emphasis. "I could get a job and not have a mess." He stopped. "Go on," said Lenny, "and when the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go to a cat house." He stopped again. "Go on, George. Ain't you gonna give me no more hell?" "No," said George. So obviously something has changed, right? Oops. George is not going to be screaming at him this time. "Well, I can go away," said Lenny. "I'll go right off in the hills and find a cave if you don't want me." George shook himself again. "No," he said. "I want you to stay with me here." Lenny said craftily, "Tell me like you done before." "Tell you what?" "About the other guys and about us." George said, "Guys like us got no family. They make a little steak and then they blow it. They ain't got nobody in the world that gets a hoot in hell about 'em." "But not us," cried Lenny happily. "Tell about us now." George was quiet for a moment. "But not us," he said. Because I got you and I got you. We got each other. That's what. That gives a hoot in hell about us," Lenny cried in triumph. Okay, almost as if life can go on like their old way. And Lenny seems to believe that it can. The little evening breeze blew over the clearing, and the leaves rustled, and the wind waves floated up the green pool, and the shouts of men sounded again, this time much closer than before. Okay, so here's where it's different, right? The men's voices are coming closer and closer, and George isn't running anymore. They were running when the book started. Sorry. Tap again, but I don't want that. Isn't running. "Take your hat off, Lenny. The air feels fine." Sorry, George took off his hat. He said shakily, "Take your hat off, Lenny. The air feels fine." Lenny removed his hat dutifully and laid it on the ground in front of him. The shadow in the valley was bluer, and the evening came fast. On the wind, the sound of crashing in the brush came to them. Lenny said, "Tell how it's going to be." George had been listening to the distant sounds. For a moment he was businesslike. Look across the river, Lenny, and I'll tell you so you can almost see it. Lenny turned his head and looked off across the pool, up the darkening slopes of the Gavilands. "We gonna get a little place," George began. He reached in his side pocket and brought out Carlson's Luger. He snapped off the safety, and the hand and gun lay on the ground behind Lenny's back. He looked at the back of Lenny's head, at the place where the spine and the skull were joined. A man's voice called from up the river, and another man answered. "Go on," said Lenny. George raised the gun, and his hand shook, and he dropped his hand to the ground again. "Go on," said Lenny. "How's it going to be? We got to get a little place." "We'll have a cow," said George, "and we'll have maybe a pig and chickens, and down the flat we'll have a little piece of alfalfa." "For the rabbits," Lenny shouted. "For the rabbits," George repeated. "And I get to tend the rabbits." "And you get to tend the rabbits." Lenny giggled with happiness. "And live on the fat of the land." "Yes." Lenny turned and said, "No, Lenny. Look down there across the river, like you can almost see the place." Lenny obeyed him. George looked down at the gun. There were crashing footsteps on the brush now. George turned and looked towards them. "Go on, George. When are we going to do it?" "Going to do it soon. Me and you. You and me. Everybody going to be nice to you. Ain't going to be no more trouble. Nobody going to hurt nobody nor steal from 'em." Lenny said, "I thought you was mad at me, George." "No, Lenny," said George. "No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I never been mad, and I ain't now. There's a thing I want you to know." The voices came so close now. George raised the gun and listened to the voices. Lenny begged, "Let's do it now. Let's get that place now." "Sure, right now. We gotta." And George raised the gun and steadied it, and he brought the muzzle of it close to the back of Lenny's head. The hand shook violently, but his face set and his hand steadied. He pulled the trigger. The crash of the shot rolled up the hills and rolled down again. Lenny jarred and then settled slowly forward to the sand, and he lay without quivering. Okay, so this was over quickly. George shivered and looked at the gun, and then he threw it from him back up on the bank near the pile of old ashes. The brush seemed filled with cries and with the sound of running feet. Slim's voice shouted, "George, where you at, George?" But George sat stiffly on the bank and looked at his right hand that had thrown the gun away. The group burst into the clearing, and Curly was ahead. He saw Lenny lying on the sand. "Got him, by God!" Right? Almost as if he's this animal, like he was a dog they were chasing. He went over and looked down at Lenny, and he looked back at George. "Right in the back of the head," he said softly. Slim came directly to George and sat down beside him, sat very close to him. "Never you mind," said Slim. "A guy got to sometimes." But Carlson was standing over George. "How'd you do it?" he asked. "I just done it," George said tiredly. "Did he have my gun?" "Yeah, he had your gun. And you got it away from him, and you took it, and you killed him?" "Yeah, that's how." George's voice was almost a whisper. He looked steadily at his right hand that had held the gun. Slim twitched George's elbow. "Come on, George. Me and you will go in and get a drink." George let himself be helped to his feet. "Yeah, a drink." Slim said, "You hadda, George. I swear you hadda. Come on with me." He led George into the entrance of the trail and up towards the highway. Curly and Carlson looked after them, and Carlson said, "Now what the hell you suppose is eating them two guys?" The end. Okay, so that was as horrible as it gets. If we go back and we look here, George kills his best friend, his only friend. And he kills him with one shot to the back of the head. And he does this. Why? Right? What's going to happen if Lenny if the men come, right? So scenario one, the men come, they capture Lenny, and I can't imagine they're not going to just beat him to death, right? It's not just Curly this time. He's killed a woman. And, you know, this would be a terrible way to be injured, you know, just severely or beaten to death. You know, scenario two, you know, George could run again, couldn't he? You know, but how many times, how long, how often have they run from something Lenny's done? And I think George understands that he just can't let Lenny go on like this, right? He's done the ultimate worst thing. He has killed a human being. He killed the mouse, as many of you noted in your annotations. He killed the puppy, you know, and now he's killed a woman, and George can't continue. You know, whatever allowed him to think he could continue like this, that's kind of run out at the end of this. And so the scenario, the third one, I mean, I'm sure there's so many more, but these are just the ones I'm thinking of. He kills Lenny himself. And it should remind you of another part of this book, right? We've talked about parallel ideas, and we can think about Candy's dog, right? Now, Candy's dog was old. Lenny's certainly not old, but he wasn't doing any good. He was, you know, he was decrepit, he was smelly, he was blind, you know, he was never going to get any better. And I believe that Steinbeck is making this point because I don't think Lenny is ever going to get better. Traveling alone with George, you know, so much is said about what maybe we could do, or why didn't he just put him in a home? Why didn't he just leave him somewhere? Why didn't he just, you know, and in 1937, 1940s, you know, the options for a man like Lenny were few and far between. He would be absolutely institutionalized. He would most likely be either drugged or he would be chained. He would be locked away. And I think George knew that the only option at this point was killing his friend. Oh, so what a way to end a story, huh? Okay, we're going to be doing some more thinking about the end of the book, things that have led up to the end of the book. And over this next week, we're going to take a look at our annotations and the notes that you all prepared that are, I'm going to have you guys post. And we're going to put together the puzzle and try to answer the question, you know, what is Steinbeck telling us with this short little story of these two beautiful men and just, you know, the saddest ending that you could ever imagine. Okay, so we will be speaking soon, and I'll talk to you guys later.